and uproot decades of precedent affirming a woman's right to an abortion. If this report is accurate, the Supreme Court is poised to inflict the greatest restriction of rights in the past 50 years, not just on women, but on all Americans. Under this decision, our children will have less rights than their parents. The Republican-appointed justices' reported votes to overturn Roe v. Wade will go down as an abomination, one of the worst, most damaging decisions in modern history. Several of these conservative justices, who are in no way accountable to the American people, have lied to the U.S. Senate, ripped up the Constitution, and defiled both precedent and the Supreme Court's reputation, all at the expense of tens of millions of women who could soon be stripped of their bodily autonomy and the constitutional rights they've relied on for over half a century. The party of Lincoln and Eisenhower has now completely devolved into the party of Trump. Every Republican senator who supported Senator McConnell and voted for Trump justices pretending that this day would never come will now have to explain themselves to the American people. I'll have more to say later this morning, but I want to make three things clear. First, now that the court is poised to strike down Roe, it is my intention for the Senate to hold a vote on legislation to codify the right to an abortion in law. Second, a vote on this legislation is not an abstract exercise. This is as urgent and real as it gets. We will vote to protect a woman's right to choose, and every American is going to see which side every senator stands. Every American is going to see on which side every senator stands. Third, to the American people, I say this: the elections this November will have consequences because the rights of 100 million women are now on the ballot. To help fight this court's awful decision, I urge every American to make their voices heard this week and this year. I urge Americans to call their members, to write their members, to email their members, to text their members, and most of all, to cast their ballots. Make no mistake, the blame for this decision falls squarely on Republican senators and the Senate Republicans as a whole, who spent years pushing extremist judges, spent years confirming 3 far-right justices to the Supreme Court, but who claimed somehow this day would never come. But this day has come, and we will fight it all the way. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President,
The Republican leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
For years, the radical left has attacked the institution of the Supreme Court. Last night, it appears their campaign hit a new low. Historically, the justices, clerks, and staff have prized and protected the court's confidentiality. The justices must be able to discuss and deliberate in an environment of total trust and privacy. Americans cannot receive a fair trial if politicians, pundits, bullies, and mobs get a say in court. Judicial independence is vital, but the far left has spent years shamelessly attacking it. Democrats in Congress have endorsed plans for partisan court packing. They've sent the justices threatening legal briefs. They've scheduled sham hearings to smear judges. In 2020, the Senate Democratic leader marched across the street to the court and shouted threats at multiple justices by name if they didn't rule how he wanted. In 2018, activists literally chased senators around the Capitol. And now, last night, a shocking new breach. Somebody, likely somebody inside the court itself, leaked a confidential internal draft to the press, almost certainly in an effort to stir up an inappropriate pressure campaign to sway an outcome. The radical left immediately rallied around the toxic stunt. The cheerleaders for partisan court packing applauded what they suggested was the work of, quote, a brave clerk, making a last-ditch Hail Mary attempt to cause a political firestorm and cause the court to reconsider. Liberals want to rip the blindfold off Lady Justice. They want to override impartiality with intimidation. They want to elevate mob rule over the rule of law. The same political movement that used a leak to move up the timeline of Justice Breyer's retirement process is trying to use yet another leak to make the court less secure and less impartial. Never before in modern history has an internal draft been leaked to the public while the justices were still deciding a case. Never before. Whoever committed this lawless act knew exactly what it could bring about. The justices already require security. Less than 2 weeks ago, an unbalanced person lit himself on fire on the court steps. Less than 3 years ago, a liberal mob tried to storm the court, shoving past law enforcement and pounding on the doors. Look, everybody knows what kind of climate the far left is trying to fuel. One that is antithetical to the rule of law. Right on cue, top Democrats began publishing wild statements about what the court might decide, packed with using unhinged rhetoric that could easily light a match. So what else happened? Activists flocked to the court. An angry crowd surrounded the court, chanting justices' names. There are renewed calls to smash the institutions of both the Senate and the court at the same time. One of the court's most essential and sacred features was smashed just to buy the outrage industrial complex a few extra days to scream nonsense about what the court might rule. This lawless action should be investigated and punished to the fullest extent possible. The fullest extent possible. I'm certain the Chief Justice will seek to get to the bottom of this. If a crime was committed, the Department of Justice must pursue it completely. So listen, I want all 9 justices to know there are still principled senators who have their backs no matter what. There are still some people in this Capitol and a majority in the Senate whose support for the rule of law is not conditional. Not conditional. The court should tune out the bad faith noise and feel completely free to do their jobs. They should follow the facts and the law wherever that leads. As I've warned in the past, courts bowing to activist pressure would never enhance judicial legitimacy. It could only erode it. And the hostage takers would never settle for half a loaf. Now, Mr. President, on another matter, an unfortunate routine keeps playing itself out with the Biden administration. First, they implement bad policies that create problems. Then they propose solutions that are really just more bad ideas. Case in point is inflation. Democrats spent last spring unleashing a deluge of reckless spending on our recovering economy. They spent the rest of the year trying to pull off yet another taxing and spending spree. And now they want to pass a massive tax hike while families are already hurting. Unfortunately for the American people, the same thing is playing itself out in the world of energy policy. Since day one, the Biden administration has done its best to wage holy war on American domestic energy production. The predictable result, thanks to these policies and the broader inflation that Democrats have fueled, is that American families are hurting badly. Across the board, energy costs have risen nearly 32% in a year. But now comes the third part of the unfortunate routine. A slew of bad far-left policy choices and proposals that would make the pain for the American people actually even worse. Some Democrats are pushing for a massive new tax on companies involved in developing and exporting American energy. The last time this wrong-headed idea was given legs, President Carter ended up reducing domestic production, increasing our foreign dependence, and raising Americans' prices at the pump. And over the last few weeks, the Biden administration took 2 more steps in the wrong direction. After ignoring federal law by failing to award a single oil or gas development lease for 5 straight quarters, the administration has shrunk its land offering by 80%, while jacking up its royalty rate by 50%. That's right. Democrats' response to supply shortages and sky-high prices at the pump is to make American energy even less available and even more expensive. Meanwhile, it's begun to tear up the regulatory reforms put in place under the last administration to streamline infrastructure project permitting. Biden and his team struck the match on a historic surge in energy prices and are now making it even more expensive for American producers to boost supply. They endorsed a bipartisan infrastructure bill and are now making it harder for American builders to get the work. And of course, Democrats are still itching to resurrect their Green New Deal. In the midst of historic inflation, they want to jack costs up even further for consumers while making America wildly dependent on China and other regimes with abysmal environmental and labor standards. The same Democrats who don't want us responsibly exploring for oil and natural gas also don't want us responsibly exploring for critical minerals either, and want to tie up American manufacturing in red tape. So the administration's war on American energy has left destruction in its wake. The only idea they have left to try is the one that would have worked from the beginning. Unleash the abundant, affordable, and reliable supply we've got right here at home.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Republican whip.
Mr. President, is the Senate in quorum call?
Yes, we are.
I would ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I just want to briefly associate myself with remarks of the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, with respect to the alleged breach of the Supreme Court, and reiterate that this is a lawless action if it turns out to be what we believe to be true, and it should be investigated and punished as fully as possible. The Chief Justice has to get to the bottom of this, and if there are, if applicable, the Department of Justice needs to pursue any criminal charges. And let me just say, too, Mr. President, that I believe, as Senator McConnell pointed out, that all 9 justices on the Supreme Court should tune out the bad faith noise and feel totally free to do their jobs following the facts and the law where they lead. We need an independent Supreme Court, and we should at every turn be defending the independence of our Supreme Court. Mr. President, the Biden border crisis is still getting worse. In March, U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered 221,303 individuals attempting to cross our southern border illegally. 221,303. That's an average of more than 7,100 individuals per day. And as of April, that number had gotten even worse. An April 26 memo from the Secretary of Homeland Security reported, and I quote, "In the past 3 weeks, CBP, or Customs and Border Patrol, has encountered an average of over 7,800 migrants per day across the southwest border. This is compared to a historical average of 1,600 per day in the pre-pandemic years of 2014 to 2019, end quote. Let me just repeat that, Mr. President. In the past 3 weeks, CBP has encountered an average of over 7,800 migrants per day across the southwest border, compared to a historical average of 1,600 per day in the pre-pandemic years. The situation at our southern border, Mr. President, is out of control. And it's on track to get much, much worse. On April 1st, the Biden administration announced that Title 42 COVID-19 restrictions, which provided for the immediate deportation of individuals who've crossed the border illegally, will end on May 23rd. It's ironic that even as the President has effectively declared that the COVID emergency to be over at our southern border, his administration continues to advocate and press Congress for more COVID funding. Once Title 42 restrictions are officially lifted, the flood of illegal immigration across our southern border is expected to become a tsunami. The Department of Homeland Security expects as many as 18,000 migrants per day to attempt to cross our southern border after the policy is lifted. 18,000 per day. That's more than double the number we're currently experiencing, which is already straining the Border Patrol to the limit. Secretary Mayorkas testified last week that morale in the Border Patrol is low. Not surprising. What will it be like for these men and women when their workload more than doubles? Mr. President, Title 42 restrictions were never intended to be a permanent border solution, and lifting them would not be a problem if it were clear that the President is ready to deal with the resulting immigration surge. But the President hasn't even been able to, or hasn't bothered to, come up with a plan to address our existing immigration crisis. And the plan he's offered to deal with the unexpected surge when Title 42 restrictions are lifted is inadequate, to put it mildly. To give us one example, the administration plans to increase Customs and Border Protection detention capacity to 18,000. The problem with that is that, as I said, we could be facing an influx of 18,000 illegal immigrants per day when Title 42 is ended. Given that individuals usually stay in Customs and Border Protection custody for 2 or 3 days, it's clear that the detention capacity of 18,000 is likely to be woefully insufficient. Even some Democrats have criticized the administration's plan, with one noting that, and I quote, "The administration's plan for the end of Title 42 is unrealistic by May 23rd. Another Democrat said, and I quote, "There hasn't been enough preparation. We don't have the basics of how are you going to handle 18,000 individuals a day safely in accordance with our ethics and principles. That plan I haven't seen yet," end quote. A number of Senate Democrats have criticized the president's decision to end Title 42 right now. And while I appreciate their speaking up, I wish that they had decided to join Republicans in supporting an amendment to preserve Title 42 border policies when we voted on it last August, or the amendment Republicans supported in February of last year to boost funding for security at our nation's borders. Then perhaps we wouldn't currently be in a situation where we expect to see 500,000 individuals a month attempting to illegally cross our southern border. Mr. President, out of control illegal immigration represents a serious security threat. Criminals, including human traffickers, drug smugglers, and gang members, regularly attempt to cross our southern border. And the worse the situation at our border gets, the easier it is for these individuals to make their way into our country. Our Border Patrol officers do heroic work, but they are stretched incredibly thin and have been for more than a year now. And it is simply common sense to acknowledge that the greater the flood of illegal immigration they have to contend with, the easier it's going to be for bad actors to get across the border. Just last week, Secretary Mayorkas testified that there were more than 389,000 what he calls gotaways, which are individuals the Border Patrol saw but was unable to apprehend at our southern border during fiscal year 2021. 389,000 got away. How many more are there likely to be if the influx at our southern border more than doubles? Mr. President, securing our border, and by that I mean having actual operational control of who enters our country, is a national security imperative. And it's unfortunate that President Biden doesn't seem to realize that. He began his administration by rescinding the declaration of a national emergency at our southern border, halting construction of the border wall, and revoking a Trump administration order that called for the government to faithfully execute our immigration laws. In other words, President Biden immediately gave the green light to those who would exploit our broken immigration system. And he has continued to implement measures that have served to convey the message that the United States borders are effectively open. And while his Title 42 decision has finally forced him to offer a so-called plan to deal with border security, the measures he proposes to take are unlikely to deter the expected surge of illegal immigration once Title 42 is lifted. As a result, by the end of this month, our nation may be facing a security, enforcement, and humanitarian crisis at our southern border that makes our current crisis look like child's play. Mr. President, the administration must do more to develop its response plan before the President lifts Title 42 restrictions on the 23rd of May. But the truth of the matter is, it is almost unquestionably too late for the administration to be adequately prepared for the coming crisis by the end of this month. I hope the President will recognize that and delay the May 23rd date until he has an adequate plan for dealing with our current border crisis, as well as any additional influx from lifting Title 42 border restrictions. If he does not move the May 23rd deadline, then Congress should step in and do it for him and stop our nation's current border crisis from becoming a true catastrophe. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, over recent decades, globalization, and by that I mean depending on the cheapest producer of a particular good and disregarding the vulnerability of supply chains, has characterized our global commerce. By and large, that's been a good thing, particularly for consumers, if you're talking about toys for your children or an appliance, let's say. Everything from ag products to innovative technologies can find a place in global markets, and that can benefit consumers. But this interdependence creates serious risks as well. And over the last couple of years, we've seen how supply chain vulnerabilities can bring an entire industry, or perhaps even an entire country, to its knees. Some of the clearest examples have surfaced during the pandemic. The U.S. leans heavily on Chinese manufacturing for masks, gloves, gowns, and ventilators, otherwise known as PPE. Not the ventilators, but the masks and gloves. And for a long time, that didn't seem to be a problem. Then COVID-19 showed up on our front doorstep. China held most of the supply for its own healthcare workers, leaving the rest of the world to scramble and compete for what little product was available here at home. Suddenly, we were unable to protect our healthcare workers with PPE and the equipment they needed in order to deal with people sick with the virus. As the American people now know all too well, the pandemic taught us supply chain lessons that extend far beyond personal protective equipment and medical equipment. One of the biggest vulnerabilities that came to light was the semiconductor supply chain. Now, chips or semiconductors or microcircuits are critical components in the most used products here in America, whether it's your smartphone, your computer, your TV, your car, airplanes that you may fly in, cell towers, just about anything with an off and on switch. That's what semiconductors power. It also includes critical defense articles, everything from fighter jets like the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, our fifth generation jet, to the Javelin missiles now being used to take out Russian tanks in Ukraine. As much as we depend on a strong supply of these microcircuits or chips currently, we also depend on other countries to make them. 90% of the most advanced semiconductors in the world are made in Asia, with the lion's share being made in Taiwan. I recently visited Taipei and the Taiwan Semiconductor Company, where they manufacture chips designed by other companies all around the world. It's a great business model for TSMC, and it's good for the designers of the chips because TSMC, being located in Taiwan, can make it for about 30% less than a fab or manufacturing facility here in the United States. But the problem is we make 0% of the advanced semiconductors in the world right here at home. And that's a huge risk. In the summer of 2020, I introduced the Bipartisan Chips for America Act with my friend and our colleague, Mark Warner, the senior senator from Virginia, to incentivize companies to reshore the manufacturing of semiconductors here in America. It's really chilling to think about how vulnerable we are to this semiconductor supply chain. Think if there was another pandemic or a natural disaster, or heaven forbid, the People's Republic of China decides to, quote, unify with Taiwan. That would jeopardize our access to these advanced semiconductors. It would have an immediate negative impact on our economy. The Department of Commerce said we'd go into a recession immediately, and depending on how long it lasted, it would have catastrophic consequences. But the bill that Senator Warner and I introduced became law at the start of last year as part of the National Defense Authorization Bill. And for the last 16 months, we've been working on a way to fund this CHIPS program. In the coming days, the House and the Senate will begin to resolve the differences between the House and Senate versions of recently passed bills. And I'm proud to be serving as a member of that conference committee. And I'm eager to dive into negotiations with our colleagues. And there certainly is a lot of urgency. Like so many supply chain vulnerabilities, once we realize that vulnerability exists, we can't necessarily turn it on a dime. It's going to take a lot of investment and perhaps a year or more to develop the capacity to manufacture these chips here in America. And what's more, the global demand for semiconductors is expected to increase by 56% over the next decade. Think about 5G. Think about artificial intelligence, quantum computing. We rely more and more on technology and thus more and more on semiconductors every day. And we will continue to do so into the future. So it's absolutely critical that we start investing in domestic chip manufacturing and do it now to ensure that we have the capacity to meet our economic and national security needs. But, Mr. President, as we all have learned, recent events haven't just taught us about the importance of a strong semiconductor supply chain, it's also taught us a lesson about energy security, about having reliable sources of energy. I don't remember that energy security was much a part of the conversation before the Russians invaded Ukraine and Europe realized they were solely dependent on Russian oil and gas. So the war in Ukraine opened the world's eyes to the dangers of that dependency on a single supplier, particularly one like the Russian Federation. And then Putin is using the profits from the price of oil, which has gone through the roof because of this uncertainty. He's using that money to fund his unprovoked war against Ukraine, as well as threaten NATO and our other allies who don't want to prop up Russia's war machine. Here in the United States, we don't rely on Russia to keep the lights on. Russia accounts for about 2% of our crude oil and petroleum imports, allowing us to ban Russian imports without risk of a major disruption. But our allies in Europe are not so lucky. They don't just rely on Russian oil, they also need Russian gas. And we've learned that Putin's not afraid to use oil and gas as a weapon to tear up, threaten, and intimidate his adversaries. That was underscored in January of 2009 when Russia effectively turned off the gas to Ukraine for almost 3 weeks. This had an impact on at least 10 countries in Europe whose natural gas traveled through Ukraine. And today we're seeing that movie replayed again. Russia recently cut off the supply of natural gas to Bulgaria and Poland as retaliation for their support of the sanctions that we've imposed against Russia because of the Ukraine invasion. In many ways, the risks that we're seeing with the global energy supply today are similar to the supply chain vulnerabilities we have with semiconductors. When you rely upon a single country for critical products, the decisions made by that country's leader could cause the supply to be cut off at a moment's notice. This has obviously been a wake-up call for all of us. All countries are taking a hard look at where their energy supply comes from and trying to find ways to diversify their sources of energy and to insulate themselves from geopolitical disruptions. And the United States is no exception. In recent years, our conversation about energy policy seems to have been consumed by debates about what's the impact on the environment of fossil fuels. And I think the debate has largely ignored questions about how policies that were being proposed would impact energy security. Many of our Democratic colleagues have proposed everything from fracking bans to unfeasible zero-net deadlines to pie-in-the-sky proposals that, frankly, are unlikely to pass. And they also are fantasies being foisted on the American people, clearly not in the interest of our economy or our national security. But we know the president has the power of the pen, and he's repeatedly used it to undermine our domestic oil and gas industry here in the United States. Only hours after he was sworn in, President Biden canceled the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline and halted all new energy leasing and permitting on public lands and waters. The Biden administration recently announced that it will resume oil and gas leases on federal lands. That was good news. But then it undercut that announcement by saying it reduced the amount of land available and significantly increased the overhead costs or royalties that must be paid to the federal government. By these kind of policies, the Biden administration has effectively discouraged investments in new production here in America. And the American people are paying the price, including at the pump. Even when President Biden eventually makes the right decision, it seems to always come after a lot of delay. It took weeks, for example, and the looming likelihood of congressional action before the president banned Russian oil imports. The climate-only policy or approach to energy policy isn't going to cut it anymore. We can't just look through a soda straw at what our energy policy is. We have to look at both the intended and unintended consequences. And I believe our top priority must be to ensure that the United States and our friends and allies around the world have access to affordable energy. Now, I want to be clear. I support efforts to diversify energy sources and reduce emissions. And I think one of the best contributions to that has been the move from coal to natural gas when it comes to producing electricity, a significant reduction in emissions by that move alone. Now, back home in Texas, we embrace an all-of-the-above energy strategy that includes oil, gas, wind, solar, and nuclear. All of the above makes sense because you want a diversification of your supply, something we found out again, or were reminded of when we had a big freeze about, I guess, about a year and a half ago now, which not only shut down our renewable sources, the wind turbines and solar panels, but also froze the gas pumps that compressed natural gas that pushed it through the pipelines. So having a number of options and allows you to be nimble and more flexible in the case of an emergency. And we produce more electricity from wind turbines than any other state in the nation, even our friends in California, which may shock some people. On top of that, Texas-based companies are making serious strides in energy innovation, which I believe ultimately is the key to energy security and a cleaner environment and reduced emissions. Texas-based companies are finding ways to make our most prevalent and affordable energy sources cleaner. I believe we could do more here in Congress to encourage that kind of innovation and diversification of our energy sources, but those efforts must come second to energy security, which should be job number one. The fact of the matter is renewables are not close to being capable of providing all of our electricity needs. In my state, it's about 20%. I think that's roughly the average around the country, but renewables account for less than 20%, I believe, across the board of our electricity generation. We know the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So you need a base load. When Mother Nature fails to deliver an adequate supply of energy, we need reliable base load, which means nuclear, oil and gas, and geothermal and hydro, where you can get it. If the president continues to wage war on American oil and gas companies, we will not have the capability to protect ourselves or our allies. Energy security is national security. If that fact was ever in doubt, Russia's actions have provided complete clarity. Our top priority must be to pursue our independence, and we do that by diversification and more production here at home. If we're able to bolster renewables invest in carbon capture technologies, and take other steps along the way to reduce emissions, that's great. But priority number one for the United States and our allies must be energy security. The sooner the Biden administration views the oil and gas industry as friends rather than adversaries, the better off all of us will be. We are blessed to live in a resource-rich country. And there's no reason to put the energy security of the U.S. and our allies at risk because President Biden is trying to placate a part of his political base. The war in Ukraine is already highlighting global energy security risk. We don't need to make that problem worse. We don't need to make it worse. We need to make it better. Now, I'm not suggesting either that we embrace isolationist energy policies like the 1970s oil export ban, but we do need to take decisive action to reduce the world's reliance on authoritarian regimes. Just as the pandemic led us to reevaluate vulnerabilities in our supply chains for semiconductors and personal protective equipment, this war is also pushing us to reevaluate global energy security. So I hope this crisis, if there's anything good that comes out of it, will serve as a reset button for our energy security efforts and discourage those who want to increase our dependency as opposed to maintaining and developing our energy security by diversifying our energy sources and taking advantage of the natural resources that we have been blessed with in America.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise today to call for the rapid confirmation of Kenneth Winston to be Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. The Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis, or INA, sits at a critical juncture between the analytic work of the intelligence community and the information sharing role of the Department of Homeland Security. The Undersecretary receives and analyzes intelligence and law enforcement information related to Homeland Security and ensures its prompt dissemination throughout the department, as well as to federal, state, local, and tribal departments that need this information to protect our nation. The nominee, who has been before our committee and passed out, comes with an incredible background for this position. Ken Winston served the United States throughout his career as a federal prosecutor, at the highest levels of the FBI as general counsel and chief of staff to FBI Director Robert Mueller, as U.S. Attorney for D.C., and as the first ever Assistant Attorney General of the Justice Department's National Security Division, and as Homeland Security Advisor to President George W. Bush. The truth is, after a remarkable career, he went into the private sector, and the fact that he's willing to come back and serve this administration, although he was a career official on the other side, speaks to his character. The role of heading DHS intelligence is not without challenges, which is why we need this confirmed undersecretary. The INA mission continues to evolve and mature since its creation in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, and there's a clear tension between its dual missions, national intelligence and departmental priorities. Some members, including myself, were very unhappy with the INA's operations in Portland in 2020, and then disappointed that the INA provided next to no warning about what was to come on January 6, 2021. These episodes clearly revealed work needs to be done to improve DHS and INA in particular. At the same time, we all know the First Amendment protects Americans' right to free speech and nonviolent peaceful protest. And our fundamental role of our government is to defend the Constitution, including these First Amendment rights. As the confirmed head of DHS's intelligence operation, Mr. Winston will be charged with ensuring that DHS INA keeps upholding those standards and protects civil rights, while also ensuring that INA's work is completely apolitical. To summarize, the role of the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis is critical for the Department of Homeland Security and the country. Consequently, I ask unanimous consent that, notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate consider the following nomination: calendar number 792, that Kenneth L. Weinstein of Virginia to be Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. That the Senate vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate. That the motion to be reconsidered be considered made and laid upon the table, and that any statements relating to the nomination be printed in the record.
Is there a second?
Mr. President.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object, we learned last week that the Department of Homeland Security has established a Ministry of Truth. They're calling it the Disinformation Governance Board. How Orwellian. Now, the details are scarce of this effort, but one would assume that the DHS Intelligence and Analysis would be part of that effort. The nominee being considered today was one of the architects of George W. Bush's administration bulk metadata collection at the NSA. What a great recommendation for him, sarcasm included, which gathered the private electronic communications of millions of Americans without warrant. Is this someone we would want to be involved in Biden administration's new Ministry of Truth? I will not provide my consent to expanding the surveillance state and the suppression of First and Fourth Amendment rights of Americans. I oppose this nominee and object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President, I think we have an incredible nominee in Mr. Weinstein. He has served our government in the Justice Department, at the FBI, at virtually every level. I think if my colleague, the senator from Kentucky, is concerned about this, we ought to have somebody that's confirmed in this role. And I would acknowledge that there are members who share his concerns about First Amendment rights, including one of the members of our committee, who has worked through Mr. Weinstein and was part of the group that unanimously voted to move him forward. I'm disappointed by the objection, and unfortunately, both the security of our country and, candidly, the protection of those First Amendment rights is undermined by not having this nominee in place. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Ohio.
Ask unanimous consent to officiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I ask for consent to speak up for up to 2 minutes on the nomination.
Also without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I urge my colleagues to join me in advancing the nomination of Elizabeth de Leon Bargava to be Assistant Secretary for Administration at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Ms. Bargava would oversee offices responsible for recruitment and staffing, procurement, and providing administrative support of HUD employees. She'll ensure the department takes steps to retain the best talent and grow HUD's workforce to meet current and future needs. Yesterday, I rode to Washington on the Commercial United flight with Secretary Fudge. She's working hard every day to serve her former constituents. I live in her old congressional district, and to serve this country, she needs qualified employees confirmed like Ms. Bargava. For more than 4 years, Ms. Bargava serves as New York State Deputy Secretary for Labor and Workforce, directly responsible for the workforce policy and operations affecting more than 9 million New Yorkers. She recognizes that program continuity depends on strong leadership at the top and meeting the department's urging staffing needs. Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the nomination of Ms. Bargava to HUD.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is expired. The question occurs on the nomination. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Brown, Collins, Padilla, Rounds, Schumer, and Warren. Senators voting in the negative: Cornyn, Crapo, Grassley, Sass, and Scott of Florida. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mrs. Murray, Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Blunt, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. No. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner. Aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. No. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz. No. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio. No. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith. Aye. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen. Aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney. No. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. She specific. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye.
The yeas are 54, the nays are 42, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 674, Elizabeth DeLeon Bargava of New York, to be an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Elizabeth DeLeon Bargava of New York to be an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Heinrich. Schumer. I got you. Senator Leahy. Merkley, Klobuchar, Whitehouse. Thank you, Senator. Thanks. I did get you, thank you. Smith, Cantwell. I did, thank you. Rosen, Cortez Masto. This Shots. Thanks. Thank you. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. I did. Thank you. Mr. Paul. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Booker, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Gillibrand, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kane, Kelly, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lujan, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Portman, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Tillis, Van Hollen, Warner, Whitehouse, and Young. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. McConnell. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Cornyn, Cotton, Fisher, Haggerty, Johnson, Lee, McConnell, Paul, Rubio, and Toomey. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Ms. Lummis? No. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Manchin, aye.